I've got to ask you about the Ant Financial IPO. We were all, I mean, it was a sort of second or third tier story last week given the elections, but everyone was absolutely stunned when all of a sudden we were waiting for it and they just decided not to do it. And I'm wondering if you can, this is the biggest IPO of all time, so it's not, it's certainly very important. I'm wondering if you could tell us, do you have any sense of when it might actually occur, number one? And number two, what exactly happened here? Was there a problem with them trying to basically teach a lesson to Jack Ma about being so outspoken? Or is there some other issue going on here that is not quite as obvious, or some other subtlety that we're missing? Can you just lay it out for us briefly? Brendan, you there? I think we lost Brendan. Well, here's the important point, people, and I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in, or Nick or Matt, you want to weigh in on this at all, but the key thing here was the Chinese authorities wanted to imply somehow that they needed to get more control over Ant Financial, that this was essentially a company that was doing massive amounts of loans in China, and essentially then pushing the loans off to the banks themselves, that they actually had no real skin in the game. They were simply facilitators. And I think Chinese authorities were very nervous about that. At least this was the story. I wanted to get Brendan's reaction to that. But the way it played out in the Western media, it was largely, oh, Jack Ma, I think having sensed this was happening, came out and said, well, this is crazy. There's too much regulation of ours. And he was responding to the pressure that the regulators were putting on him. So I guess the question here, Nick, and I don't know if you have a thought on this, is it seemed to me what really happened here was Chinese authorities were already sending noises out there to him that they were going to be subject to more regulation, and Ma was angry about that. And Ma's reaction caused them to bring him in, but it wasn't going to stop the fact that they were going to try to get more control over them. So it's a very interesting sort of situation. Matt or Nick, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got structurally the right narrative. The one thing I would add is, if you look at the Chinese online payment system, it's dominated by two players, Ant and WePay. They have like 80% market share in the online payment space, and it's something that has really astounded other central bankers. I mean, Federal Reserve officials like Loretta Mester have talked about how odd it is that two companies dominate that. And I think the Chinese government has looked at it and said, yeah, that really is actually a problem, and we do need to work on figuring out how to structurally make it more sound, because it is probably the biggest structural risk to the Chinese banking system. So unfortunately, they came to that realization a bit late for this IPO. I'm sure it'll happen at some point in a year or two, but it is, it was probably the right regulatory thing to do. It just wasn't particularly handled well.
Right. I completely agree with that. I cannot believe that the Chinese authorities waited till 5 days before they started. I mean, obviously there were negotiations going on before. See, I think that's what happened. Ma responded to the fact that there were all these negotiations going on, and he vented his frustration in the weekend before the IPO, and then they had to call him in. But they didn't cancel the IPO because Jack Ma sounded off. They were having problems, the authorities, already. And I think you're right, Nick. Who could blame them? You've got the biggest lender in China out there that's not really a bank, that's facilitating all these loans, that doesn't have any loans on its book, because basically we're just an application center, and we ultimately it's the banks that hold the loan. Well, that's an awful lot of loans to be pushing out from the public, and that's a big issue. I think we've got Brendan back right now. I don't know if you'd heard us before the question, Brendan. I just want to get a quick response from you about, number one, do you know when the IPO might actually happen? And number two, could you just give us your quick narrative of what happened? We've had a brief discussion about it without you, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, very unlikely to happen until about at least a minimum of 6 months. I think it looks like this thing had the rug pulled from underneath it, and to some degree it did. At the same time, you had this more regulatory environment coming. The company really portrayed itself as a technology company, got that very high valuation, but it was going to increasingly fall under being regulated like a bank. And I think the regulator said, all of the revenue, profitability is in the IPO prospectus is backward looking. And under this new regulatory regime, the company is still a great, great company, but certainly the level of profitability is going to come down. And so I think as much as it's in a disappointment, I think the regulator is saying to investors, you need more insight into how the regulation is going to affect this company going forward.
Right. That seems completely reasonable to me. And Nick and I have been having this conversation. But I guess what frustrates me is why wait now? I mean, it was 5 days before the IPO. It seems like Jack Ma responded to all of this pressure from the regulators saying, wait a minute, you're just offshoring, you're just pushing these loans off to the banks, but you really are a lender, and we may regulate you like that. That seems very reasonable to me. They've got to get a hand around this. But why 5 days before or 6 days before? This should have been something that came out a couple of months ago. Don't you think that's reasonable, Brendan?
Yeah. I mean, I think the company really drove to get the IPO up in advance of the new rules being implemented. And so I think the regulator's hand was forced to some degree by how quickly the IPO came together. So the regulatory environment's been coming. It's just more the IPO came faster.
I see. Okay, so your point is this is kind of a game of chicken they were playing, that if they could get this thing out before the actual regulations came in, then they're too big to fail. You can't regulate us now because we're so big. Was that the game? It's a game of chicken, right?
Yeah. And you have all this retail money, predominantly individual investor money in the IPO, and the regulator wasn't going to do something to hurt the company, knowing that you'd only be hurting all these mom and pop investors. So I think actually the regulator took a pretty pragmatic view, and for both parties in the long run, it's probably a better outcome.
Yeah. So here you see a situation where the regulators actually were very reasonable. I mean, U.S. regulators would probably have the same concerns, Brendan, wouldn't they? I mean, the way this played out initially, it sounded like the Chinese Communist Party has come down on this icon of international freedom and liberty. And while I love Jack Ma, the truth is a lot more subtle than that. Am I characterizing this right?
Oh, I agree 100%. And if this IPO had come on the New York Stock Exchange, for instance, or the NASDAQ, institutional investors would say, hey, what about this new regulation? Your numbers look great, absolutely fantastic, right? 17 billion of revenue, 10 billion of gross profit. But what would the new numbers look like? And I think institutional investors would have called the company's bluff if it had come here in the United States, and that's why they went local.
Right, and what your point is, what would the new numbers look like if they were regulated like a bank? Is that how they would be different?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, your gross margin of 58% is coming down, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
For sure.
Okay.